you get up there as executive fellow for the Arts Council?
Well, good evening, y'all, and thanks for stopping by. My name is Alex Loving, and I am on the cemetery tour because I fought in both world wars. I was a proud Tennessee volunteer, but I will talk about my military service in just a minute. I was born in 1898 out by Jones Bend Lake in a farmhouse owned by my grandfather, Dr. Alexander Loving. I was told that house is still standing, and a family by the name of Diggs lives there now. When I was 19 years old, I joined up in the military to fight the First World War. As you can see, I'm in my old uniform. I was a proud member of the Tennessee National Guard. We got shipped off to Camp Sevier, South Carolina for basic training. It was basic, all right. We didn't even have weapons. We used rifles made of wood to train with, and it was plenty cold that fall too, because there weren't enough blankets to go around. After Camp Sevier, we traveled to New York and embarked across the ocean on the Corca in a small British vessel. It took 11 days just to reach Liverpool. We finally made it to Le Havre, France, and got into the war. In St. Remy, France, we got gassed. That nasty old mustard gas affected my voice, and I had a raspy voice for the rest of my life. We made it back to the States in March of 1919, and I returned to life as a civilian. I got married to Miss Catherine Alexander. We had 2 daughters by the name of Belle and Margaret. Somewhere along the way, Miss Catherine and I got crossways and got a divorce. When she died, she was buried out at Oak Hill Union Cemetery on Highway 69 North, and I was buried here alone. I never had a set trade. I lived off my Army disability pension. I did put her around at odd jobs though, such as car repair and locksmithing. I loved cars a lot and raced a lot of them. Somewhere in between, I went to Atlanta and became a prison guard. By the time World War II had came, I was back in Tennessee and a member of the National Guard again. We got shipped to Fort Jackson, South Carolina, and fought in many battles, including Normandy, Ardennes, Alsace, and Rhineland, all over Europe. On April 20th, 1946, our unit disbanded and I returned to Paris. Fighting in both world wars took its toll on me. I died at age 49 in the VA hospital in Memphis and was buried here in the Paris City Cemetery with this simple marker. I still have family living here, and you might know some of them. My sister is Georgia Lazzie, my granddaughter is Tootsie Crenshaw, and my niece is Janice Adams. Thanks for coming by, and enjoy the rest of your visit.
As your tour guide said, my name is John R. Risen Jr. Now, I'm known in some circles as the man who rebuilt Paris. We'll get back to that in a minute, though. I was born March 9, 1884. I was the son of John R. Risen Sr. and Hinda Edmonds Risen. Matter of fact, my grandfather on my mother's side, Samuel Edmonds, was a prominent physician in these parts. He practiced in Henry County and also later in Madison County. My father, John R. Risen Sr., he owned not one, but 2 newspapers in town. He owned the Paris Post and he owned the Weekly Intelligencer. He got tired of running 2 different operations. Guess what he did? Merged them together. And what'd the name become?
The Post-Intelligencer.
That's right, the Paris Post-Intelligencer. That's where the name comes from, my father, John R. Risen Sr. Always wondered that, didn't you? Now then, like I say, I was born, since he was in the newspaper business, I was born with newsprint in my veins. But before I got old enough, he sold the PI. So at the age of 18, I actually went into the railroad business, L&N Railroad right here. That led to a position with Illinois Central down in Memphis. But you know, my heart just wasn't in the railroad business. I got to longing for home. I really wanted to be in the newspaper business. So, at the age of 35, in 1919, I moved back to Paris, and I bought a competitor to my father's paper. It was the Parisian. That was my pride and joy, the Parisian. Now, in that day, the PI was clearly dominant. But I worked to change that, and I did in the next 7 or 8 years. I amassed, but with my family's background in these parts, my family had been here a long time. Why, I started getting involved. 2 years later, 1921, I was one of the charter members of the Paris Rotary Club. I was very active in civics and in politics both. And as some folks can tell you, it doesn't hurt the pocketbook to be involved in civics and politics. Matter of fact, it was hard for the merchants to start turning down advertising in the Parisian because I was getting that political clout. Puts food on the table, don't knock it. So I was able to change the tide in the next 7 or 8 years, and the Parisian was clearly the dominant paper in town. I was riding high, I tell you. Then a dark day came, 1927. A fellow named W. Percy Williams and his 13-year-old son Bryant came up from Alabama. Bought my competitor, the PI. I had just about run that PI in the ground. I thought it was going to fold, and here somebody else comes in and buys it. All of a sudden, I got new competition, and it was fierce competition, let me tell you. For almost the next 20 years, what was known as editorial wars took place. Wow, we fired back editorials right and left. I called him an outsider. I told him to go back to Alabama, where they came from. We don't need no outsiders around here in Paris and Henry County. Called him a squirt, called him everything I could think of. Of course, he gave as good as he got, too. Then, something very fortunate for me happened. Very fortunate in a way. The Great Depression hit. He had his money in the bank, that competitor of mine, Williams. The bank folded and he lost his money. I had my family's money. I was going to be able to survive. I was going to be able to, maybe not thrive, but I was going to be able to get by. And surely I could just crush him now. And you know what else? In the midst of the Great Depression, 1932, my competitor Williams, he did the stupidest thing I ever heard of. He went from being a weekly like me, he changed the PI to a daily. Now, folks, let me tell you, there's no way that a daily can survive in a small town like Paris. And this is the Depression. Where is he going to get the newsprint and the ink? How is he going to put out a paper every day? I'm having trouble putting out one every week. I'll stake my reputation on the fact that he'll go under, and go under soon. Trouble is, I did stake my reputation on that. No, he didn't go under. I don't know how he stayed in business, but that squirt stayed in business. And that was the height of my paper's power. After that point, started a long, slow decline. But I didn't give up without a fight. No sirree. I still used my political clout. Why, I was on the staff of 3 different governors of the great state of Tennessee. Twice I was mayor of this fair city. Why, while I was in the office of mayor, we got permanent streets around the court square. We got sidewalks. We got new modern lighting, and something else. We got rid of the horses downtown too. The hitching post, got rid of them, made them park right down here. We called it the city hitch lot. Sure enough, the town was modern now. We were going places. While I was in office, we got our first chain store here. While I was here, the first factory opened, made cigars. Despite everything I could do, though, I wasn't winning the newspaper war. I was going downhill. The writing was getting clear on the wall, but I wasn't going to give up. I was suffering from cancer, and so I started failing health when in the 1940s I had to sell the paper. 1946 I sold, but I didn't sell to those Williamses. No sirree. No, I sold somebody else. Trouble is, 8 years later, 1954, somebody did sell the Parisian to those Williamses at the PI. I cursed that day. Where you gonna find a Parisian downtown here anywhere now? No sirree. The only place you're gonna find a Parisian is in the library. Worse yet, in the library at the PI. Well, it wasn't but a few months later, 4 days after that Christmas, that I passed away. I was living with my wife Grace right over here in Lockhart Apartments. McAvoy Funeral Home was in charge of my funeral, and it was a grand funeral, if I do say so myself. I was laid to rest here, and less than 4 years later, my wife Grace joined me. We're back together here. No children. We didn't have any children. My legacy, though, is that I'm known as the man who rebuilt Paris. Well, let me tell you something. I'd give it up in a heartbeat if I could go back and change the way that newspaper war turned out. Matter of fact, I bet some of you folks read the PI, don't you? Some of your parents and grandparents probably bought the PI instead of Parisian when I was there. I'm through with y'all. Go on, go bother some other corpse here. Leave me to rest in peace. Go on.
Come on in. I'm sure after listening to that loudmouth over there, y'all are glad to be in the presence of an officer and a gentleman. My name is Samuel H. Caldwell. I was a medical doctor. I was also a tobacco farmer, and as it says here, I was also a surgeon in the Army of the Confederate States. Now, I was born here in Henry County in 1836. In fact, my grandfather was one of the earliest pioneers in this area, and my father, Robert Caldwell, owned over 3,000 acres of land right here in Henry County. He also owned several thousand down in Mississippi, and something I wish we hadn't let get out of the family, 200 acres of prime land in what's now downtown Dallas, Texas. But nevertheless, I grew up near what we call Puryear today at Pine Hill Plantation. Now, it's one of the prettiest spots in this county, my way of thinking. But as I was growing up, my father decided once I'd come of age that he would send me off to medical school in Philadelphia. A few years later, with medical degree in hand, I returned here to Paris to set up my practice. And I was doing quite well until the War for Southern Independence broke out. Being a good Southerner, naturally, I joined up and was originally assigned to the 46th Tennessee Infantry. But before I left for duty, I did something very important in my life. I married this lady. Mary Thompson was the daughter of a local merchant, and Miss Molly, as we all called her, and I would have 4 children. But I'll talk about her a little bit later. And right now, let's go back and dispense with this war thing. As I said, I had joined up immediately and hadn't been in service long when we were on island number 10 and we were surrounded by the Yankees. Well, that's with due apologies to any of you who were unfortunate enough to be born north of the Mason-Dixon line. But anyway, I was captured, taken prisoner, and being an officer, I was sent to a prison camp just outside of Chicago. Now, it was my good fortune I was not there very long when the government, the real government, the southern states, decided that they would have an exchange of medical officers with the Yankees. So I was part of an exchange, and I was then sent to Port Hudson, Louisiana. Now, unfortunately, while I was there, I come down with a bad case of typhoid fever. And even though I was only 26 years old at the time, I really thought I'd live my last. But some good friends nursed me back to health, and I was released to return back home. Now, no sooner got back home than word came down that the great General Nathan Bedford Forrest himself was looking for additional men for his command. So once again I joined on, and this time I was assigned to the 21st Tennessee Cavalry, riding with General Forrest himself. As you can well imagine, the next few years were some of the most exciting of my life. We rode all over the heart of the Confederacy. We fought, there were numerous battles. There were Bryce's Crossroads, Okolona, Battle of Franklin, Fort Pillow, numerous battles that we took part in. And of course, I was responsible as a surgeon for treating both northern and southern boys alike of their injuries. Now, I mentioned Fort Pillow. You may remember from history that it was there that General Forrest was charged with allowing the murder of certain Union soldiers. And in fact, I always felt like maybe I played some small part in his defense because he was almost prosecuted by both the Southern and the Union governments. I had written home in a letter to my wife, which was later produced as evidence, in which I said, and I quote, "Had General Forrest not rode between our lines and the Union soldiers, not a man would have been spared." So I always felt maybe I helped for the truth to come out in that case. Nevertheless, after the war was over, I returned here to Paris and I resumed my medical practice. But in 1874, I gave that up to do something I genuinely enjoyed. I took up tobacco farming once again. And over the next several years, I prized over 500 hogshead of tobacco a year, prime tobacco. And I was very, very proud of that. I was also engaged in some other activities. Being a good Southerner at that time, naturally I was a Democrat, and I was the chairman of the local Democrat committee for a number of years. Also represented Henry County at one or two state conventions at that time. Now back to Miss Molly. Now, we were long-time members of the local Presbyterian church, but actually Miss Molly was the big Presbyterian. For you see, she was so beloved of the local congregation that early in the 20th century, the women of the Presbyterian church named their society the Molly Caldwell Missionary Society in her honor. And in addition to that, on her 90th birthday, after I'd already been gone for a few years, they placed a bronze plaque in their sanctuary in honor of her, as being their most beloved and oldest member at that time. Now, in regard to that sanctuary, I didn't live to see it completed, although I did attend a service there. But you look a little puzzled. Let me explain that, George. You see, the Lord called me home in 1917 as they were putting up the finishing touches on the sanctuary they still use today. So, once I had died, a number of my friends spent the entire night installing the pews so they could have my funeral service there the next day. And I'm proud to say the very first service in that new sanctuary was my funeral. Of course, it was also my last. Good day to you folks.
I appreciate y'all stopping by to visit me at my eternal resting place. My name is Nathaniel Currier, and I was born in Amesbury, Massachusetts in 1805. My brother Chase and I came to Henry County in 1833 in search of a suitable location for a cotton mill. We found it just northeast of here on a tract of land now occupied by the Hampton Inn and the WMUF radio station. We purchased 309 acres of land. Satisfied with the location, we returned to Massachusetts to buy the machinery we would need to operate the plant. The machinery was then shipped by water down the Atlantic seaboard, across the Gulf of Mexico to the Mississippi River at New Orleans, up the Mississippi to the Ohio, then back down the Tennessee to the mouth of Sandy Landing in Henry County. It then traveled by wagon across land to the factory location. It took 3 months just for the machinery to get here. After that, it took 3 years to get the factory up and going. But we opened in 1836 as the Chickasaw Mills. Farmers would bring in raw cotton, and we would mill it into carpet warp, twine, and yarn. We employed 42 women and 8 men. The women even had a boarding house nearby where a Mrs. Keith fed and supervised them. When I moved to Henry County, I was single. But on January 18, 1842, I married Miss Martha Manor. She died 5 years later. Then in 1849, I married Miss Mariah Blanton of Frankfort, Kentucky, and we had several children. The Chickasaw Mills thrived even during that great war of northern aggression you've heard so much about. But then along 1867 or 1869, I can't remember which, my sister-in-law, Chase's wife, decided that she had had enough of life in the near wilderness of Paris, Tennessee. So Chase sold his half of the factory to me, and they moved back to the Boston area. As my tombstone says, I died in May of 1877, but that was not the end of the Chickasaw Mills. My son, John T. Currier, buried over there, carried on. The year after I died, the old wooden 30-foot by 40-foot factory that Chase and I built burned to the ground. But John T. rebuilt immediately. But this time the factory was 40 by 100 feet, constructed of brick, and powered by steam. John T.'s son, John Nathaniel, went into a different kind of business altogether. In fact, it still operates on the Court Square in Paris today. It's a men's clothing store called the Toggery. Now, John Nathaniel died in 1971, but his daughter, my great-granddaughter, Mary Isabel, you may know her as Mamie, and her husband, Bernice Beard, kept the store until their retirement just a few years ago. Then they found a nice couple by the name of Hopkins to sell the store to, so you can still shop at the Toggery today. I sure do appreciate y'all stopping by and let me share a little bit about my family with you. Hope you enjoyed the rest of the tour. I believe Miss Tilly Cavett Barton is waiting for you just down the way. Y'all have a nice afternoon.
I'm Tilly Cavett Barton, wife of Orrin Conyers Barton, mayor of Paris, and daughter of Neander Young Cavett, direct representative to the state legislature. My Christian name is Tillis, but as you might imagine, everyone calls me Tilly. Well, I guess you're wondering why I'm buried here beside my parents rather than with my husband. Well, you see, I was the second Mrs. Barton. I was always proud of my heritage, and 2 decades or so before the war between the states, when Henry County was still young, my grandfather, John Fournier Cavett, purchased from James C. Currier a farm just north of the city limits of Paris and built a house there. By the time I was born, in 1857, the house and farm lay well within the city limits of Paris. It was a fine 2-story Victorian-style home with a 3rd-story round tower, and they named it Cavett Place. The house was located on North Poplar Street. My father, N.Y. Cavett, and my mother, Sarah Ann Bailey Cavett, were people of substance. Many people thought Cavett Place was the finest residence in the entire city of Paris. Mr. Barton was a widower with 2 small girls when we married, and we had 1 daughter of our own. I loved them all as though they were my very own, and I tried hard to provide for them equally. After they were grown, I had my friend Pearl Roughton paint a set of china for each of them, and one for myself as well. Family members now own those china sets. My husband was a traveling salesman for a hardware company out of Louisville for 14 years, as well as part owner of a tobacco buying firm in Cottage Grove, the community where he was born. Well, desiring to end his travels, he purchased an interest in the Freeman and Lassiter Lumber Company of Paris, and the firm became known as Barton and Lassiter. He was a successful businessman, but it wasn't until he invested in the tasteless chill tonic of E.W. Grove that he became a wealthy man in his own right. Many people said he was Henry County's first authentic millionaire. In 1902, Dr. Grove, who by then had moved to St. Louis, asked my husband to present a gift offer of $20,000 to the county if they would purchase and build a public high school. The Squires turned him down with regret. Times were hard, they said, and the county was just recovering from the effects of a 3-year smallpox epidemic. Well, Dr. Grove was undeterred, and 3 years later came back with an offer of $50,000 to establish a trust fund if the county would build the high school. Well, this time his offer was accepted, and my husband was chosen as the chairman of the first original board of trust. Later on, my husband and I were able to contribute to the Grove School a co-ed dormitory, a 2-story brick structure which became known as Cavett Hall, and also an athletic field which became known as Barton Field. Over the years, we were able to provide for Union University Barton Hall. We provided the Woody Barton Gibson Retirement Center in Nashville, and the Barton Building for the Baptist Children's Orphanage in Franklin. My husband was very active in local as well as statewide politics. He was mayor of Paris for 4 years, and during his tenure, a public waterworks and an electric light company were established. He was president of the city of, of the City Board of Education and of the Commerce and Industrial League of Paris and Henry County. He was also the leader of the temperance forces of Tennessee that was successful in electing Ben W. Hooper as governor in the turbulent election of 1910. It was shortly after that that tragedy struck, or perhaps some people call it opportunity in the disguise of tragedy. Cabot Place burned. The volunteer firemen did their best to control the blaze, but it was too intense, and so we decided to rebuild. In order to show our appreciation to the firemen, we purchased each of them rubber coats, hats, gloves, and boots, which was the first personal equipment the firemen ever owned. We kept the name Cabot Place for the new building, and many people again thought it was the finest residences in the entire city. A National Architectural Digest photographed and carried pictures inside and out of the building. The building is still standing today, and of course you know it as the Heritage Center. But I suppose no history of that building would be complete if I did not tell you about Dink. He was born into slavery, and as long as I knew him, he worked for our family. Dink had the mind of a child, and before his mother died, she asked me if our family would take care of him. As long as he lived in one of the upstairs rooms of the house, and passerbyers were sometimes surprised to see Dink, who loved to get into my husband's cigars, sitting on the front porch in a rocking chair, puffing away as though he owned the place. Well, my daughters sometimes complained that Dink did have the best toys. Thank you.
I am Susanna Gilliam Dunlap. I was born May 19, 1775 in Buckingham County, Virginia. My parents were Devereaux Gilliam and Edith Ellis Gilliam. I died January 6, 1859 at the age of 84 at the home of my daughter in Shelby County, Tennessee. I'm buried here in the Old City Cemetery. My parents moved from Virginia to Knoxville when I was 12, and they donated the land there for the First Presbyterian Church, which was then called the Lebanon Church. My husband, Hugh Dunlap, was born in Londonderry County in 1769. He came to the United States when he was 23 and disembarked in Philadelphia. Later, he came down the Appalachian Trail to Knoxville with a load of goods to become a merchant. We were married in 1791, and we lived in a home in downtown Knoxville on present Cumberland and Main Streets. Our first child was Richard Gilliam Dunlap, and he was the first white child born in Knoxville, Tennessee. Together, we had 15 children, and they are listed here with their dates. Hugh and I moved from Knoxville to Lauderdale County in 1823, as Hugh had a land grant for 35,000 acres. However, once we arrived in Lauderdale County, the entire family became sick, and our son John, who was living here in Paris at the time, came overland and brought us back here to Paris. We lived in a home on the Court Square, the corners of Poplar and Washington Streets. Richard Gilliam Dunlap was, as I said, probably our most famous child, and his accomplishments are listed on the back of this obelisk. Among them are an outstanding military career, and he also wrote a statute under which a system of public schools was first established for the state of Tennessee. Another child was James T. Dunlap, and he is buried here as well. He was a lawyer, a member of the United States Congress, as well as comptroller of the state of Tennessee during the Civil War. It was his job to protect the state's gold and silver from the Yankees. He had a daughter, one of my namesakes, Susanna Gilliam Dunlap. She married a young man by the name of General Jonathan Dawson. He was a general in the Confederate Army, and he is buried here as well. She is remembered with a beautiful stained glass window in the Presbyterian Church here in Paris. Hugh White Dunlap was another child, and he was a lawyer, Grand Mason of the state of Tennessee. William C. Dunlap was a lawyer, member of the United States Congress, and later became a state judge in Memphis. Dunlap Street in Memphis, which runs in front of Le Bonheur Hospital, as well as Dunlap, Tennessee, are named for him. Another son was John Dunlap, and he was a merchant and a lawyer here in Paris. A young man by the name of James Porter studied law under him, and they practiced law together for a while under the name of Dunlap and Porter. John had a daughter, a namesake, Susanna Dunlap, and she married James Porter. James went ahead later and became governor of the state of Tennessee. They lived in a home known as the Porter Home on Dunlap Street. John also had a son named Hugh, and Hugh married a young lady by the name of Sally Atkins. Sally's father is J.D.C. Atkins, and I think you'll meet him here later. J.D.C. Atkins gave his daughter and son-in-law a beautiful farm in Dover, Tennessee. It's now known as the Riverfront Plantation Manor. And yes, another namesake, Susanna Lamb Dunlap Murphy and Richard Lamb Dunlap IV, both of whom were born in Paris, are my great-great-great-great-great-grandchildren. To conclude, I would like to read the very kind words that are placed here on the obelisk about my family. Hugh and Susanna assisted in laying the foundation of civilization in Tennessee from the eastern to the western borders, and were the parents of sons distinguished in their native state, as well as Louisiana, Mississippi, and Texas. Thank you.
Good evening and welcome. My name is Thomas Wall Crawford. Pardon me for my ill-fitting jacket. After being dead for 117 years, the body has a tendency to lose a little bit of weight. The story of my final resting place here in Paris, Tennessee, actually begins in North Carolina. My father, Thomas Crawford, was born in Rockingham, North Carolina in 1783. I was born in Rockingham on November 22nd, 1822. My father moved my mother, Harriet Wall Crawford, and our family to Tennessee in 1826 when I was only 3 years old. Initially, we settled in Carroll County with some of my father's kinfolk, and later in 1833, we moved to Paris, Tennessee. When we moved to Paris, the town was still quite young, and I grew up with the town. We lived at the corner of Washington and Caldwell Streets in what was then known as the Judge Lamb home. I believe that's where your town library is located now. My father, Thomas Crawford, died in 1845, and both of my parents were buried in the garden of their home there. Later, they were moved here to the city cemetery, and now they're together again, resting over there at that Crawford Monument. My father, as an early settler, helped develop the county. He built mills and stores and was part owner of the LaGrange furnace. I doubt he would recognize the town now. I received my education under a scholarly Irishman named David Cochran here in Paris, Tennessee. Later I attended the University of Nashville, and I enjoyed cavorting with the sons of fine families from throughout the South. My first employment was as a manager at the furnace. Later I owned businesses and bought a farm. I have to credit much of my success, though, to my parents, as my parents left my siblings and I a significant inheritance. I always did enjoy designing and building houses. In 1848, I built a large home at what is now the corner of Dunlap and Walnut Street in the old Chestnut Grove. In 1848, I married my lovely bride, Flora Beasley. In that home on Walnut Street, my son Walter, who was resting with my parents, and my daughter Amanda, who is here with me, were born in that home. That girl of mine, Amanda's around here somewhere. Amanda dear, where are you? Come on over here, Amanda, and meet some folks. I was just telling them about our house on Dunlap Street.
Oh yeah, I was born in that house in 1851. Then Papa sold that house to Miss Mary G. Swain, and we moved out of town onto a 1,000-acre farm in the Palestine community.
Later, that house in town was bought by Hugh and Marietta Dunlap. Their daughter Susanna, whom I believe you've already met, married a James D. Porter, who became governor of Tennessee. Susanna eventually inherited that house in 1887. I've heard that a Dr. John Van Dyke bought the house in 1985 and has done a fine job in keeping the old place in good condition. It is a wonderful home. I'm glad that it is still standing and serving as part of the town and a family home.
Papa loved that house so much, he built one just like it on the farm, called it Oakland. My twin brothers, James Pickett and Charles Thomas, were born there.
I remember that year. It was 1857. I had to pay a Dr. Peter Looney $10 to help Flora with the deliveries.
Sure, little Charles Thomas died when he was only 3. Mama sure was sad back then, but now we're all back together.
The other twin, James Pickett, who is buried over there with his wife's family, was educated at Oak Hill in Palestine and later at the old academy at the corner of McNeil and Market Street. When James married, he stayed on at Oakland and continued farming for a while. Later, he decided to move into Paris, and he built a home for his family in 1907 at 506 Hudson Avenue. People always said I had a fine sense of humor and kept the company entertained. Do you know where most cemeteries are located? Same place this one is, at the end of a dead-end street. Ma'am, do you know what you get when a cow sees a ghost? Well, a milkshake, of course.
Oh, Papa, let me tell one. What did one casket say to the other? Is that you, Papa?
Well, I see y'all don't mind coming around to the city cemetery in big, large groups like this in the middle of the day, nice, beautiful blue sky, sun shining. But why don't y'all come on back around midnight, say tomorrow night, alone, and see what really happens down here at the city cemetery?
Papa always kept the kids laughing with his silly jokes.
When I was a younger man, I had a pretty good punch, and I was known as the hardest hitter among my chums. I was even referred to as the Ralph Jones of the county for the champion fist fighter of the country at that time.
Remember that time, Papa, you came home with the black eye and Mama letting you about
Now, Amanda dear, we don't need to bore these nice people with those inconsequential stories like that dug up from our past.
Oh, Papa, I was just getting started.
As I was saying, I was a member of the Methodist Church that used to stand over there. It's just a vacant lot now. I've heard, though, that the new Methodist Church downtown has a large building that they have a weekly meeting in where they eat and play something called basketball. Now, I don't know a whole lot about this basketball, but I guess some things never change. Methodists still enjoy eating. As you can see, I died on July 22nd, 1885, at the age of 62. My wife, Flora, remarried 5 years later to a J.D.C. Atkins. She outlived 2 husbands. He died in 1908. Well, at this time, Flora was living at the corner of Poplar and Rough Streets, just a few blocks from here. I've heard some reports from y'all that you can get some mighty fine sandwiches there from the local market called Lewis and Williams.
My husband, Robert H. Mills, and I lived in a cottage behind Mama's, and I took care of her until she died in 1920 at the age of 92. I died that same year.
I'm happy, though, that we're all back together here now. My parents and my children and my Flora. Well, I believe my time is running short with you this afternoon, but I want you to remember that invitation for midnight is still open for any night. I hope you have a good afternoon. Thank you.
Evening, folks. My name is Noel Crawford. Sorry you folks had to walk all the way back here, but during my time, I could not be buried with the white folks, so I was put back here, unlike most Negroes buried here in this graveyard. I have a gravestone still standing. That's it over there, upside the fence over there. The lonely grave there. Many of friends and family is also buried here, but their gravestones are gone or never was. I don't know why I was buried in this here graveyard, or even my folks are buried here, or why my stone is still standing. Could be I was better off than most coloreds, or I worked for a rich boss man, to be honest about it, I don't even know when I was born. Yes, my name is Crawford, but sure enough, no kin to Mr. Thomas Crawford, whom you just spoke with. Most likely, my folks was owned by Mr. Thomas's folks. In my day, it was not unusual for a slave owner to give their slave their last name. And if you were sold again, you could get another name. Some folks even had 3 and 4 names. Like all slaves, my folks were freed by Mr. Lincoln in 1863. Those times don't get no better. Some of my friends left here, gone north, while some stayed here to sharecrop or work in the house of the rich white folks. To tell the truth, it was hard to tell the difference between sharecropping. It wasn't hard to tell the difference between sharecropping and slavery. Yes, sirree, time was hard, but I worked to keep food on the table, clothes on our backs, and made sure the children got some good learning. Like most folks, I believe a good education would give them a better chance in life than I've had. I don't know why I was included in such an important company this evening. All I ever did was take care of my family as best I could, obeyed the Lord in all things, and tried to be the best man I knew how. I was no better or no more important than anyone else, including all these here folks buried in all these here unmarked graves to here. Anyhow, I sure appreciate you folks stopping by this evening. Now, General Atkins is waiting over there. Good evening. Thank you.
Well, greetings and salutations to y'all. My name is General John DeWitt Clinton Atkins, known to most people here in Paris as JDC Atkins for short. My family immigrated to Henry County from North Carolina. Myself, I was born in 1825 on my family farm about 9 miles east of here. I devoted my entire life to public service. I was elected to the General Assembly, which is our state legislature. I was elected to the Tennessee Senate before going on to the United States Congress. When the Civil War broke out, or as some folks like to call it, the war between the states, or the War of Northern Aggression, I left the United States Congress and returned to my home here in Henry County, and I helped form the 5th Tennessee Volunteer Infantry Regiment, the largest Confederate regiment here in Paris, in Henry County. I had some experience in the military. I got my title general when I served as general in the state militia. I remember traveling all over Henry County with a Paris brass band, recruiting soldiers for the Confederacy. I remember one time we were at Conyersville, that's between Puryear and Buchanan. A man rode up on his horse exclaiming, "The Yankees are coming, the Yankees are coming, and they're killing men, women, and children as they come." Women screamed and wrung their hands, and the men were told to return the next day with their guns. Well, we learned that that rumor originated in a West Kentucky schoolhouse as a practical joke. I'll never forget May the 20th, 1861. Paris beheld such a scene on its streets that is never likely to witness again. Before the middle of the day, thousands of people poured in to downtown Paris from every district along every road in our county, as men signed up for the Confederacy. You see that iron fence behind you there? That iron fence used to be around the Henry County Courthouse. Company criers would mount that iron fence, calling their various companies together. They marched around the courthouse as part of their training before they left 4 days later. The railroad was brand new. It was built in 1860. So we got flat cars and we put cross ties on top of the flat cars for seating. And I tell you what, as our boys left, as the train steamed away, they were waved off with handkerchiefs and hearty cheers. And I tell you what, tears flowed from many an eye as that train steamed away. Well, I got sick not long after being named Lieutenant Colonel of the 5th Tennessee, and I was elected to the Confederate Congress. I served there for 4 years. After the war, I was the only man to return to the United States Congress after serving as a congressman in the Confederate States of America. I was instrumental in removing federal troops from the South. You see, much of the South was under martial law at the time. Well, that was a surprise, me being elected back to the United States Congress when no one else was. I served 2 years as chairman of the House Committee on Appropriations. Now, most of you know it is Congress that controls the purse strings in our great country, and the Committee on Appropriations makes recommendations on how that money is to be used. Well, in 1882, I retired from public service. Well, I thought I was retired. President Grover Cleveland had other plans in store for me. He elected me, or appointed me, as Commissioner of Indian Affairs for the United States of America. After serving in that position, I returned back to Paris, and I was editor and then proprietor of the Weekly Intelligencer, our local newspaper. That paper later merged with the Paris Post, and now y'all are stuck with that long title, the Paris Post Intelligencer. I served on the board of directors of the Paris Medicine Company. That was the company that was started by my good friend Dr. E.W. Grove. Well, he really wasn't a doctor, he was a pharmacist. And he came up with a concoction called Grove's Tasteless Chill Tonic, which was supposed to be a tasteless quinine. Well, I'm here to tell you it wasn't tasteless. That company became so successful that the sale of Grove's Tasteless Chill Tonic was compared to Coca-Cola. I tell you what, I continued to serve here in Paris for many years. I know lots of people that are buried here in this cemetery, including my good friend Governor James D. Porter. I'm sure you've heard of the Porter family by now. After I died in 1908 at the ripe old age of 83, the city, when they were thinking about constructing their new school, had to come up with a name for it. Well, I was really proud to learn that my good friend Governor Porter and myself were honored by having that school named for us, Atkins Porter School. Well, I'm buried right here next to my wife, Elizabeth Porter. She bore me 6 children, and I still have many descendants that continue to live here in Henry County. And every once in a while, some of my family comes and visits me. And I hope you all will return one of these days too, to return to my grave and read the inscriptions on hundreds and hundreds of these old headstones, because they represent the heritage of our great city and county. I hope you've enjoyed your time here at the Paris City Cemetery, and I hope you will return.